Hello and most welcome to H702. Today we are going to talk about language, but before anything else we have to take a look at that fantastic snowfall we had yesterday. Kalle, if you'd be so pleased to show the listeners of what's happening outside. It's the 30th of November, the death day of Charles XII, and we have a fantastic snowfall. It's white everywhere. Finally, we get some light in this rather dark November we had. The sun only showed its face like 2 times. Today is going to be something completely different. We are really widening up the subjects here. And we're actually going into language and how to learn language. And I'm just going to give some keywords before I start. Implicit rules and explicit rules for language. And the problem is as follows. And this is a problem I recognize. I've been engaged in language learning for a very long time. English, Japanese, Spanish, even some little Lithuanian, which was very, very hard to catch on. Why doesn't traditional language education work? We're spending years trying to learn a language, but still by the time we graduate, we're still not able to hold a proper conversation. And I can indeed relate to that myself. I remember in school where we had extensive training in German. I don't know how many hours weekly. And we learned vocabulary, we learned grammar, and we had regular tests almost on a weekly basis to check grammar was learned and vocab extended. Did I get any fluency? Was I able to hold a conversation? Well, I soon were to know, because off I went to venture into foreign parts. And into Germany I went, and I could not hold a conversation. I could not say anything, to be honest, very, very little. I was stuttering, and we were actually 3 people, and as it happened we all participated in the same language course for 3 years. And I might add that teacher, Ulla Henriksson, long live his memory, her memory, was an excellent teacher. Nothing else could be said about her. She was encouraging, she was ferocious when it came to the grammar. But we didn't speak a word German, although we took 3 years. Imagine our disappointment. How many hours hadn't we spent in class torturing us ourselves? We didn't even get good grades because those were taken by the Germanic children, children descendant of Germans, who obviously had a pretty nice fluency for free from the beginning. So when I heard now that there are implicit rules and explicit rules in language learning, I started to get a feeling, because what I learned when I was in Germany and continue to speak with German people all over Europe were that I never used the explicit rules I've been taught in school. I don't think I used durch, für, gegen, ohne, what, not a single time. I used it on the tests, yes, but I never used it when I was talking to anyone. Or neither did I use it later when I was writing German. Never. And it did actually caught my mind. I was wondering, isn't this weird? I have a very, very clear sense that I was doing some other rules, but they were not the rules I learned explicitly. But rules they were, that I know. Actually, I had to forget what I've learned to learn German. I had to redo the whole learning, and also had to actively forget what I learned. Only by shoving Durchführung, I had to say that's things that regulate the accusative in German. Only by shoving that into the background could I learn German. And the same actually was true many years later when I learned Japanese. I had little, if any, use of the rules I was given in language. And especially the distinction between the wa and ga, which is not non-existent in any European language, and it defies descriptions actually. That I learned by hanging with Japanese people in Japan, but I can't to this day even give an explicit rule what it does. Does something, I have an implicit feeling when I should use it, but I could not for the love of life explain what it does. And I remember stumbling upon a book on my colleague's favorite place, the UBE. And it was a book that only considered the differentiation between wa and ga. And it was this thick. This thick it was. So, well, this gives an indication where this lecture is going. I haven't got into the juicy stuff yet, but I got a feeling, so I should read this whole book to know this. Well, fair enough, but in the actual speaking situation, how would I be able to get all that's in that book into the actual act of saying something? I didn't know how that would work, but I know instantly it wouldn't work. It's impossible. Let me give you an example. You go to English class and you start speaking and you say, I comes to school. And the teacher will correct you and say, no, my son, it's I come to school. Now you got corrected, and the idea is you could apply that to next time you use those words or similar words. The teacher wants to give you an explicit rule, and it's also the matter of conscious control and correction. We will see that that is extremely limited, And now to the name of the theory. It's rather long, but it's called the Natural Order Hypothesis. And it was first proposed by Stephen D. Krashen. And it's coming from an extensive investigation into which part of the language we learn first. So let me give you an example to just put you into the right ballpark. When you learn English, one of the first grammar things that we learn is gerund. That is the progressive form. I'm cycling, I'm biking, I'm eating, and so forth. It comes already within 3 months if you're completely new to the language. Whereas third person singular, how you conjugate he, she, it, you put an S in English, that comes much later. Actually, it comes first after 8 to 9 months. Could even take 1 year, 1.5 years, and there is actually a considerable amount of fluent speakers who even in their fluency do not use it, are not able to understand the rule. So these investigations has shown rather surprising things. And I'd say it's surprising even more so for me, because we don't have gerund in Swedish. We have a horribly complex thing we have to do instead. And if there are any English speakers there, I'm just going to have to tell you to understand how we have to go about those things. And I think it can actually help to understand what is an implicit rule, because you don't know what you're doing. Instead, in Swedish, when we want to do something similar to gerund progressive form, we use the posture words. So, for instance, I am now standing. So in Swedish there will be I stand and I talk. And if you were to be lying down, I'm lying, you'll have to say, well, if I'm lying down sleeping, you have to say I am lying and I'm sleeping, and that has to always be that, the lying. You can't only say sleeping, you have to say I'm lying down and sleep. And that is completely other implicit rule. It's not a gerund and it takes much longer time to learn. And then you think, yes, of course, it's more complex. Well, I would say my first feeling is gerund is much more complex than third person singular plural, or singular, third person singular. I'd say that. And this is what this investigation showed. There is no obvious feature that you can understand how the language learning passes. So it's not necessarily so that the complex things in the learning come last. They can actually come very early on. And the second thing is, the simple things does not necessarily come early on in the natural order language learning. It can come much later, and they might not come at all. Rather surprising, I'd say. So the natural order is not based on any obvious features of simplicity or complexity. Some things look simple on the outside, but they are very hardly acquired early on. Others that appear complex are acquired early on. So this presents a problem, of course, to the one who's designing the curriculum, because they present the rules in language from simple to complex. The second thing that this investigation has shown, that is that the natural order cannot be changed. It is actually immune to deliberate teaching. A teacher can drill a third person singular for weeks, but it will not come until the person is ready for it. So your will or the teacher's will or any training cannot change when you acquire something you want to learn in language. And this, of course, explain a lot of the frustration language students have. It's enormous. It's a lot of complaining, and it's just grievance many times. Very unlike other subjects, the amount of time you spend learning something often doesn't pay off at all. And I have an example myself actually. I learned all the irregular verbs in Spanish by heart, by writing them on a whiteboard and then repeating them in my head. And I did them in all the conjugations, which was all the persons and all the conjugations, which filled up the whole whiteboard only with one verb, because there's a lot of conjugations in Spanish. And I learned all the irregular verbs by heart, but I never ever used them while talking, not a single time. I did refer to them once when somebody asked about how come it's called kepo. And then I remember the table, and then I explain how you use kepo. It's a really weird irregular verb in Spanish, but that's the only time. And actually when I said that, it sort of shook me. How come I never used these tables, these graphs I made, or these diagrams I made? Not one single time. So I had no use for them. I had other use for them. It actually helped me to understand how important it is to learn things by heart, and that you actually get better with other things. And I think that is actually helping now when we try to understand what this investigation has shown, because that could be a sort of a sign or a lead, piste as they say in Spanish, but to understand this. So now we learn about this natural order, so then we are up for solution number 3. Well, if that's the case, why not arrange the curriculum so it goes like the natural order of language acquisition? Yes, and weirdly enough, that's a no there. It does not help to follow the natural order of language acquirement. And that's maybe the most amazing thing about this investigation. Let me get into the juicy stuff now. Suspense. Let me introduce you to a hypothesis. And this is called the monitor hypothesis. A monitor is a surveyor of sort. In the olden days, a monitor used to be a sort of stand-in teacher. They had blue hats and they helped the students to learn. So they were monitoring them. So think of the monitoring hypothesis as you have a little monitor inside of yourself or somewhere. The conscious learning you do has only one function, as a monitor or editor. Here is how it works. We're about to say something in another language. The form of our sentence pops into our minds thanks to our subconsciously acquired competence. Then just before we actually produce the sentence, just before we say it, we scan it internally, inspect it, and use our consciously learned system to correct errors. So first there is a sentence popping up, and then the monitor comes into action and do changes. You can also do that afterwards. So you can use your conscious monitor to correct sentences after we said them. This you can call self-correction. So while the monitor can make a small contribution to accuracy, the research indicates that acquisition makes the major contribution. Thus, acquisition is responsible for both fluency and most of our accuracy. It's difficult to use the monitor. In order to use the monitor successfully, 3 necessary conditions must be met. Number 1 is, of course, the acquirer must know the rule. This is a very difficult condition to meet. Research linguists freely admit they do not know all the rules of any language. Those who write grammar text know fewer rules than linguists. Language teachers do not teach all the rules in the texts. Even the best students don't learn all the rules they are taught, and even the best students don't remember all the rules they have learned. Even the best students can't always use the rules they remember. Many rules are too complex to apply while engaging in conversation. Think about the Why and Ga book I looked upon. You can imagine my dissatisfaction to see that book. I thought, I have to learn this book and then I put it into a conversation. Number 2 is this. The acquirer must be thinking about correctness or focused on form. This is hard to do. It's hard to think about both form and meaning at the same time. And what a good point. I always thought about that. Because firstly, it's something I had to say. And then I had to put that into a format. And the format in its second part has to be corrected by the monitor. There's actually 3 parts. It's a rather complex system. And it's not hard to see this takes a lot of time. Much more time than you have at hand when you're having a conversation. In order for a conversation to work, I must be able to engage in subjects with the one I'm talking to. And then my focus should be on meaning. What is the other person saying? What should I say? Not the form. And this does speak to what I remember. I remember this constructed discussions where you look very much into the form, and they took a certain time and they didn't feel right, didn't feel natural. Although I liked them because, I don't know, they felt very ceremonial, but they never felt like a proper discussion. And it's in the proper discussions we learn to put the new words with the meaning. Otherwise we do something else. And that's the feeling I had with this ceremoniously having debates or something like that, simple debates in language class. The monitor is weak, but it's not useless. Some conscious knowledge of language can be helpful. Acquisition does not typically provide us with 100% of a language. There is often a small residue of grammar, punctuation and spelling rules that even native speakers do not acquire, even after extensive oral and written comprehensible input. In English, these can include the lie and lay distinction. Well, that's a tough one. The its and its distinction, and spelling demons such as separate and commitment. How many T? Because our standard for written communication is 100% this aspect of language need to be learned, but they make up a small part of our language competence. We pay a price for the modest amount of accuracy we got from the monitoring. Some research show that when we focus on form when speaking, the grammar, the vocab, we produce less information and we slow down. This can seriously disrupt conversation. Some people over-monitor and are so concerned with grammar and accuracy that speech is slow and painful to produce as well to listen to. And that goes for a friend of mine who tried to learn through a grammar book to speak. And he waited and he thought and it went slow. And of course, the meaning wasn't there and the conversation wasn't fluent. And I started to understand meaning wasn't connected to the new words and the new grammar. Instead, you had a like system that worked above, a special thing, new thing. This is a site from Ernst Hemingway in another country. The major, who had been the great fencer, did not believe in bravery and spent much time while we sat in the machines correcting my grammar. He had complimented me on how I spoke Italian, and we talked together very easily. One day I said that Italian seemed like such an easy language to me that I could not take a great interest in it. Everything was so easy to say. Ah, yes, the major said. Why then do you not take up the use of grammar? So we took up the use of grammar, and soon Italian was such a difficult language that I was afraid to talk to him until I had the grammar straight in my mind. The best advice from Stephen Krashen is, I think, is not to use conscious monitor when it does not. Use the conscious monitor when it doesn't interfere with communication. When we have time, for instance, when you're editing a piece of writing you've written, or you're going to make a speech. Instead, Krashen suggests this coming hypothesis. It's called the input hypothesis, or the comprehension hypothesis. The input hypothesis attempts to answer the most important question in the fields of language acquisition and language education. How does language acquisition occur? The evidence strongly supports a simple hypothesis. We acquire language in only one way: when we understand messages, when we obtain comprehensible input. We acquire language, in other words, when we understand what we hear or what we read, when we understand the message. So it's a little bit that form and meaning comes hand in hand, actually the same thing. In recent years, I use the term comprehension hypothesis to refer to the input hypothesis. Comprehension might be a better description. Mere input is not enough. It must be understood. The idea is certainly not new with me. In the field of second language acquisition, James Asher, Harry Winitz and et al. Proposed similar ideas before I did. And in the field of literacy, Frank Smith and Kenneth Goodman have proposed that we learn to read by reading and by understand the message on the page. Comprehensible input has been our last resort in language teaching. We have tried everything else: grammar rules, repetition drills, computers, etc. The input hypothesis claims, however, that comprehending messages is the only way language is acquired. There is no individual variation in the fundamental process of language acquisition. That's rather interesting. There is no individual variation in the fundamental process of language acquisition. So for instance, there's no one who learns the third person singular before the gerund. No one. Isn't that interesting? And if you would have asked me, I would say everyone learns the third person singular first. But when I say this, and I think this shows the point even clearer, the only thing I am struggling now with in English is the third person singular. I have immense problems with it. Immense. I have to correct myself every time I speak. It does not come natural to me. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense. It's super simple. We almost have the same rule in Swedish. Almost. But the same rule does apply in German, in a way. So why don't I learn it in English? Well, of course, that is a mystery. But what we learn now is everyone learns in the same order. And it doesn't really matter if you try to teach in another order. So the input comprehension hypothesis can be restated in terms of natural order hypothesis. Let us assume a very simple version of the natural order hypothesis, that we acquire the rules of language in linear order. 1, 2, 3. The question of how we acquire language can be restated as: how do we move from rule 3 to rule 4, from rule 987 to 988? More generally, if I represent the last rule we have acquired, how do we move from I to I plus 1, where I plus 1 is the next structure we are ready to acquire? How do we move from one rule to another? The input hypothesis claims that we move from I to I plus 1 by understanding input containing I plus 1. We are able to do this with the help of our previously acquired linguistic competence, as well as extra linguistic knowledge, which includes our knowledge of the world and our knowledge of the situation. In other words, we use context. For beginners, pictures are a tremendous help in making input comprehensible, as well as body movements that are at the core of Asher's total physical response method. Somebody is saying something and the other one is just responding physically to that. That's apparently a very helpful way of learning language. I recall, and I remember when I read it, how many times hasn't the reaction from the other person actually taught me significant things? Because the body response is much quicker than the words, and you can almost see directly if the person has understood and what you have said actually, because you see in the other person, what was it I said? sort of try I say this. I have an example here. I was buying fruits a lot of times in Greece, and they always said like, this is like $5 for 2 kilos. And I saw some signs in the beginning. I saw 2 kilos are like $5 or something like that. And I realized after a while that the implicit rule I sort of constructed unconsciously wasn't correct. I noticed in situations that when I bought something where 2 kilos was supposed to be $5 or $10 or something like that, I had to pay much more. And that's the situation. And when I sort of questioned the whole thing, the reaction from the other person was very hard to explain, but that reaction taught me something. I'm not being tricked here, I got something wrong, but I don't know what it is. It's like it opened up a little bit, but something was wrong here or wasn't correct. My implicit rule wasn't correct. And I think all of a sudden it just bloomed on me that they were using the expression 2 in 2 different contexts. First 2 was the English 2 kilos. The other one was the definite article in Greek. As you would say, the kilo costs. And then it dawned on me explicitly, but I already grasped the difference implicitly, almost to 100%. That explicit knowledge was unnecessary, although interesting, but it had no part to play in the language acquisition, and I understood the whole thing. Everything was implicit. Because I already know when he or her, the body movement, you understand that something is off or something is with my understanding, and that got regulated. And that also is so much more helpful, because if I would explicitly think and sort of in my conscious part of the head try to understand it, I would have gotten even more wrong, because I would directly say, why would they use a definite article for kilo? But that doesn't happen in the situation. That knowledge is not stopped, because here it's an open situation. My body reads directly, my eyes reads directly. It's not stopped what I consciously think is possible. My previous knowledge doesn't stop me there. I thought it was very interesting. Now, of course, there was a moment when I thought it was tricked. You get the feeling you're not being tricked somehow. The body knows you're not being tricked, or somebody's being sloppy. So, the input hypothesis maintains that speaking does not directly result in language acquisition. Talking is not practicing. If you practice your French out loud every morning in front of the mirror, your French will not improve. Rather, the ability to speak is the result of language acquisition, not a cause. Speaking can help language acquisition indirectly, however. First, it can result in conversation, and conversation is an excellent source of comprehensible input that we need to understand. What counts in conversation, however, is what the other person says to you, not what you say to them. I suspect that speaking can help in another way. It can make you feel more like a user of the second language, like a member of the club. And that is, of course, so as well. You learn much more from other people, because they are sitting with the information, not you. And whereas you get more convenient with the pronunciation, I would say, in my case, when you speak, of that, you learn the meanings and the words from others in their complete reaction. And then the body needs to be there, definitely, because that can help in every time you get stuck in your head, which is a lot of times. So you see here, the two languages, Greek and Swedish, both have explicit rules. Those explicit rules, if I know them, they will stop me from understanding. They will put limits to the understanding. It would send the mind into the wrong direction. And the second is that it's not even there where the acquisition is happening. Something else is happening there. Yes, I would even say some sort of learning takes part, but it has no connection whatsoever to the implicit learning. There's no connection there. It's interesting, but it's no connection. Both things can be fine. So that this is rather interesting theory, and all of a sudden I realize now while standing here, this is actually incredibly helpful to understand that very, very shortened explanation I realize now that David Bohm gave about implicit and explicit. And I have no doubt in my mind, well, I don't even have to say the words, of course David Bohm himself knew exactly what he was talking about. And that knowledge was very, very well grounded after all those years as being a scientist. But what he describes in his book is pedagogically not sufficient to get an understanding of this. It's a start, and it opens up your imagination. But this hands over much more information, because all of a sudden I started to realize that both explicit and implicit carries rules, but the implicit rules are quite different from the explicit rules. And this is what, of course, David Bohm was saying, or meaning, or not saying, rather. But his feeling from the whole thing came, of course, from his mathematics, and that mathematics is not in the books. You can't practice quantum theory in the books. It will be a little bit distance. So I realized what would have been needed, a book just about the implicit and explicit. And that book could be as big as the Vaga, but you will actually practice something that you could have use for, whereas the Vaga book is something that could be used to elevate a table that's too short or something like that, but it can never ever be used for any purpose whatsoever, and there was no reason writing it. It's just waste of ink. Poor chap who wrote it, he must have had really boring time. I hope for the one lecture in the future when I take up this again, which I'm going to definitely, but I might continue even pretty soon. It would be nice to show this Vaga book, how big it is and what on earth that person was thinking. So this was rather different, and I hope you have something to bring back home after this lecture, and I say thank you very much.
Thank you.